before. I don't think it's just a difference of, orders of magnitude. And the thought that we could have at least a publicly perceived library that has the imprimatur of the US government that takes whatever records there are of the Trump presidency and fashions them into a narrative that is completely at odds and divorced from reality and is used to perpetuate what's been called the big lie about the election results, and I think really terrifies me. At the same time, and I know we're going to talk about this more, I think the prospects for real significant legislative change are not great. So I think, one of the things that we're all wrestling with is, what's the right answer? And is there anything we can do if Congress doesn't act or doesn't take dramatic enough steps? And so I'm sure that we'll be talking about that today.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you both for those brief introductions. Maybe just by way of kind of laying some groundwork, Anthony, I could get you to explain a little bit more about presidential records. In particular, I was really interested to learn about the process whereby decisions are made about what is and what is not a presidential record, and how the Trump administration may have used some of that ambiguity or some of that freedom in ways that will hamper future historians, future journalists from writing clearly about what happened during the administration.
Well, I'm going to defer to Anne when it comes to those particular types of questions about the administration of the Presidential Records Act. And Anne, if you want to take that now, or I can and I can follow up.
I'll come back to that. So why don't we start with the broader question about who makes the decision what is a presidential record?
Well, that's what I mean. As far as I understand it, the president makes the decision. And the president can get guidance from the archivist about whether or not a record is temporary. And if a record is temporary, it can be disposed of. And under current law, the White House has to request guidance, written guidance from the archivist before disposing of records. I'm not sure that's always been followed. And I understand from reporting that it hasn't been followed during the Trump administration. Is that correct, Anne?
To my knowledge, it hasn't, but then we wouldn't know because there's no provision in the Presidential Records Act that requires the archivist to make public any of those requests.
That's a good point. I think the only thing that we know publicly, as far as I know, is that under the Presidential Records Act, the sitting president can restrict access to presidential records for an additional 7 years past the 5-year point. But that has to be done while the president is in office. Now, once the president leaves office, the president can relax those restrictions, but must make the actual restrictions while in office. And so in February of 2017, President Trump signed a letter at the urging of the National Archives, as I understand the record, to restrict all 6 categories of his records for the entire 12 years. Now that's pretty common because if you don't have the right to do that after you leave office, the National Archives guidance, the written guidance that they've made public says that the president should restrict, to begin with, all 6 categories. Every president has subsequently relaxed those restrictions. I'm not optimistic that former President Trump will relax those restrictions in the intervening years.
And you said that every former president, has relaxed those restrictions. How has that come to pass? Has that been that people have come and made specific requests about access to certain records, or is there a kind of a step-by-step process whereby this just happens over a period of time?
Well, the process has been murky in terms of how it comes about, but the National Archives has released documents that show when the president does relax the records restrictions and under what circumstances. And so there was pressure on Bill Clinton to relax those restrictions when Hillary Clinton was running for office. There was pressure against George W. Bush after his presidency when people were still looking at what happened in Iraq, what happened in Hurricane Katrina, what happened in Afghanistan. And so those relaxation documents have been released. But I'm not quite sure of the process as to who approaches the president, whether it's the National Archives, and if so, whether or not it's because of records requests specifically for those records.
And when I had a conversation with you back in January, I was interested in the mechanism whereby we could get sooner and wider access to presidential records. That rather than simply accepting the idea that they're going to be under seal for this period of time, what would it take to change that? And is there precedent for that?
Well, right now, under the Presidential Records Act, Congress and the courts have access. They need to request it from the archivist, and the archivist has the right to determine that Congress and the courts can have access. But in terms of the public, the only way that the public could have access prior to the 5-year or to the 12-year, if the president doesn't release or relax those records, is a change in the law. Congress would have to fundamentally change Presidential Records Act. And without getting too much into the weeds, the only reason why we have the 12-year restriction is that in 1978, this was a new idea. Prior to the Presidential Records Act, presidents owned the records and took them with them and disposed of them as they saw fit. And so they were the ones to not only deed them to the government, but decide who gets them and when. So in the negotiations over how to craft the Presidential Records Act, the 12-year restriction period was given as kind of a buffer so that there would be more of a widespread agreement in Congress that this would be a good idea, because former presidents and many future presidents, or at least people who thought they would be president in Congress, were worried about people getting access right away. The 5-year period, just to give you an idea of how different records have changed, in 1978, the first 5-year period was from the National Archives. They requested 5 years so they would have time to review, process, and open the records. That was the assumption, that it would take about 5 years to at least arrange and describe and start processing them. It's taking at least 100 years now to open the records of any given presidential library. So that 5-year period was way off. And the 7-year additional period was really a negotiating tactic, decades ago, that really doesn't apply today.
Let me turn to you, Anne, because I began by asking Anthony about how the Trump administration had followed these policies, such as we can ascertain it. I know there've been stories of the president tearing up documents in the White House and archivists having to piece them back together. There have been controversies about the use of social media, taking pictures of WhatsApp files, deleting metadata. What do you know at this point about how well the Trump administration actually complied with existing law?
We know some things, but not a whole lot, frankly. And I do want to make one point up front, which is you started out by asking, what is a presidential record? And if you look at the statute, it defines it very, very broadly. And I would argue that there's almost nothing the president does that doesn't qualify as a presidential record. The few exceptions we know about are certain political activities that the president may engage in, and correspondence with a family member that's strictly personal. Anthony is absolutely right that there is a provision that allows a president to with the archivist understanding, to dispose of records. But my understanding is that has been viewed very, very narrowly in the past, and only used, the example I was given was to be able to dispose of basically the letters from the public that the president gets, for example, because they're technically presidential records. So I think it's the reason I start with this, it's important to understand that just about everything the president commits to writing or some form of a record is worthy of preservation under the express terms of the statute. And that's why the president's practices and the practices of his White House were so troubling. As you mentioned, there were the early reports that the president was ripping up his notes. And I actually talked to one of the people who had been assigned the job of following him and literally taping them together. When that story came out, I think they were fired. There were early stories that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were using an email server that was tied to the Trump businesses, which is remarkable given, of course, all of the fuss they made about Hillary Clinton. There were early reports that senior White House officials were using these, what we call disappearing message apps, their Confide and Signal are two of them. And basically, you get a message on your phone, and as you're reading it, literally as you're scrolling, it vanishes, so that no record is preserved. Crew actually, along with some historians and other good government groups, actually challenged that practice in court and was not successful. We know that people like Jared Kushner were frequent users of another application called WhatsApp. And it is far from clear, again, that it was on his personal device, whether or not he transferred those messages with all of the metadata and attachments to an official email account. And we know, and again, this was the subject of a lawsuit that Crew and others brought, we know that the president really resisted creating records in the first place. For example, the multiple times that he met with Vladimir Putin, he took steps to ensure that no records were created. He didn't have note takers present. There's a story that was published that he seized the notes of at one point of the translator. He didn't have notes taken of his meetings with Kim Jong-un. And so I think what that means is that we're going to have a huge hole in the historical record. And this is just what we know about, because while the president is in office, there is no accountability to anyone for what the president is doing on the record keeping front, not to the archivists and not to the public. So I very much fear that when the archives eventually goes through Trump's records, they're going to find out that it's actually worse than we know.
Well, there's a bill out there, I believe, I don't know if it's still active, you can tell us more, to change the law and bring it up to date with the fact that presidential records are now mainly electronic records, and these records sort of proliferate under all sorts of different systems, social media systems, email systems, cell phone apps. What is the status of the Murphy-Quigley bill, and what would it do to bring the current law up to date with current forms of record keeping?
I should, Anthony may know the status more than I think he's follows legislation more, but I mean, I think it's a really good first start. It makes it, it makes it clear that presidential staff should not be using personal email accounts and other personal devices to conduct presidential business. One of the provisions in it that I think is the first time this has even been floated is the idea of tying access, once a president leaves office, tying access to their records and other artifacts and to the assistance that the government offers to compliance with the Presidential Records Act while in office. So it has some really good provisions, and it was an effort to grapple with the changing technology and all of the challenges that it imposes on everyone, not just the White House.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, do you know the status, or do you want to comment further on that particular act?
I don't know the status, but Ann makes a good point about the provision that ties cooperation with the National Archives to the performance while in office. With the new Obama model, which does not give the National Archives a role to play at the Obama Center, they're just going to run a private museum, much like at least in terms of structure, much like the Nixon Foundation for 17 years or 16 years ran a private museum, but had an agreement with the National Archives to feature documents and artifacts and memorabilia. I think that tying that to performance is important, because if a president decides, well, I don't need the National Archives, I'm just going to go on my own, I'll do what I want, there's still the idea of not quite the strong imprimatur of the National Archives logo on the door, but it's still, well, these are records, these are materials that belong to the people, but they're here in this private museum. There is still that kind of less strong, but still a kind of an idea of support, which we wouldn't want to give to a former president who acted atrociously in office when it comes to record keeping. I think Ann's absolutely right.
So it gives some teeth, but in general, what has been the enforcement mechanism for the current law? Does the current law have any teeth? And we have this image of somebody running around behind Trump and piecing together his torn up documents. How would that person actually have had the ability to do that, given what we know about the state of the Oval Office and the degree to which that had been kind of closed into a very narrow group of supporters of the president?
Well, I'll tackle this. The answer to the enforcement is there is absolutely none while a president is in office. The archivist has absolutely no authority over the president. The archivist can offer guidance if guidance is sought. Historically, there has, in a typical administration, there's been, I think, a good working relationship between NARA and the White House, starting almost from the beginning, because it's an enormous undertaking to accession all the records of a president, even if it's just 4 years and not 8. That really begins, at the beginning of an administration. They start to plan for that, and the archives needs to get some sense of volume, etc. I don't know what the relationship was like with the Trump White House, but I do know that while Trump was refusing to concede the election, he did not allow, one of the consequences of that is that the transition, including, the transition from having his NARA help with the transition of his records, did not take place. It was very late. And the enforcement thing, when Congress enacted this law, one of the things they assumed was that presidents would want to keep the records of their presidency because it's a tribute to them, right? It's their legacy. Every president will want, of course, a full historical legacy. They never envisioned someone like Donald Trump, who I think really his legacy is what he says it is, not what the actual documents of his presidency say. And the courts have been very, very wary to wade into this area. I mentioned that, I've brought a number of lawsuits. I have, going way back, and have not been successful because the courts view any effort for a judge to rein in the president as possibly unconstitutional, as sort of treading on the president's Article 3 powers to do what he wants while he's in office. And as long as that concern is lurking there, it means the courts aren't really available. I don't know what would happen in the most extreme case if a president just said, I'm not going to keep records, or I'm just going to have a bonfire. And for all we know, President Trump did that. So it's a real problem. And I think it's a particularly acute problem with respect to Trump's documents, because there was the period of time, after the election, before he's never yet conceded, but it was still unclear when the transition would happen and how, he had to realize that he faces potential liability on a lot of fronts. There's a lot of litigation out there, both on the criminal and civil level. And to the extent that he may have taken steps to destroy records or make sure they never fall into the hands of, the public or anyone in government, we don't know. We simply don't know. But certainly a lot of articles have been written by, noted journalists and historians, raising the significant fear that did happen.
Philip, I could just add.
I was going to just jump in at a little bookkeeping here, just to welcome people to the panel. If you're joining us, I see there are a few more participants, but also to invite people to send questions. And I might just ask Lisa briefly if anybody has done so, and should we pause for a moment to respond to folks who are listening?
We don't have any questions yet, though I would encourage people to ask their questions. We've got a real wealth of knowledge here on this panel, so take advantage. I would also just note, though, one thing: the PAST Act is we expect it to be reintroduced this Congress. I don't know if that was quite clear earlier in the day. So we do expect that act to be introduced. So we'll just go from there. But again, if there's any questions, please do chime in on the chat.
Great. And then
Oh,
Anthony, you were about to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think Ann is absolutely right that there has been a long history of cooperation with the White House and NAR. I think the major change really happened in the George W. Bush administration. And just two quick anecdotes. One is that senior Bush officials used the Republican National Committee email system to conduct White House business. And then we lost many millions of records based on that. And second, during the Bush administration, the National Archives office that coordinates secured compartmentalized information facilities, or SCIFs, that look at classified records, they have an enforcement authority to go around and look and conduct audits of how federal agencies are handling classified records. And when they tried to look at how the vice president's office was handling classified records, Vice President Cheney refused. When the Information Security Oversight Office insisted, Vice President Cheney recommended that that office be abolished. And so I think even before Trump, we were seeing the White House resisting the idea of National Archives having any information about what they were doing prior to the end of the administration.
You said that the vice president recommended abolishing the office. Was that office in fact abolished? What was the fallout?
It was not.
Okay.
No, it was not.
Maybe moving on a little bit to the other half of this question, which is the presidential library itself. And Anthony, I know you wrote at the time when a lot of people were thinking about the possibility of a Trump library, you wrote a very measured assessment saying you didn't think it was likely to happen. And to make that claim, you had to sort of lay out some of the particularities of the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself. Just give us a brief sense of why you think it's unlikely that we will see a Trump library.
I mean, in a nutshell, it's expensive, it's complex. There are a lot of responsibilities and regulations involved. That doesn't describe anything that Donald Trump has done in his life: following the law, following the rules, raising money in a consistent and legitimate manner, and then using it for the purposes for which he claimed to have raised it. I think that in addition to that, there's the idea of location. I mean, every president has had, to one extent or another, difficulty in finding a site to place his library. I'm not sure that Trump would have as much finding any site. I mean, for example, when Richard Nixon was in the wilderness years and couldn't find a place, a city in Kansas offered a free plot of land and tax breaks for him. The downside was that it was Leavenworth, so it was not a going concern for. That's a true story. So I think the question isn't whether or not President Trump or former President Trump can find a place. I think he could probably find some place, but whether that place would be like his recent predecessors at universities or in places where the public could easily access it. I think if he does have a location that might be more along the lines of West Branch, Iowa, where Hoover is, where it's not connected to a major institution and it's not connected to, say, a major city or some sort of organization. But again, it's taking hundreds of millions of dollars now to build these facilities. If you want the National Archives to have a role to play, then you have to give 60% of the cost of the part of the building that you give to the National Archives in addition as an endowment. So that's an additional problem. And I also think there are questions as to what he's going to be doing as a former president in 2022, in the midterms, as well as 2024. And so if you build a presidential library, that's the capstone, right? You're no longer going to be running for president. There's no precedent for a president to build a presidential library while out of office and then come back and run again, which is why I think is one of the main reasons we haven't seen any announcement from either the White House prior to January or now the office of former President Trump about what his plans are for that.
Let me follow up on that. It's a really fascinating question because it's been a long time since we've had a president who potentially could run again and maybe even be president again. I'd like to ask both Ann and Anthony, what are the issues there? If Trump came back as president, what kind of control would he have over the records of his previous administration? And are there things he could do or not do that would essentially just terminate the idea of public access to presidential records?
Well, I'll start. As you probably know, there's absolutely no precedent for this. So the statute because the statute says nothing, I think technically, legally, his records would still be the records of a former president and would be subject to, you know, the processes and timeline that the Presidential Records Act spells out. That said, if he were reelected now as an incumbent president, I'm sure he would try to find a way to use the power of the presidency to restrict access, further access to the records of his, then that would be his first term. But the statute, as far as I know, I don't know that I've never seen anything in the legislative history to the Presidential Records Act that even contemplated this possibility. And I think technically the records remain, you know, there would essentially be two sets of records. But again, I think there is the possibility, and in my mind, the risk that if he were reelected, one of the things that President Trump would do would be to use the power of his office to try to further restrict access to the records of his first term.
I just wanted to say there's one word in the Presidential Records Act which gives us a maybe something to hang our hats on, which is consecutive. The definition of the presidential record says consecutive terms. And so that might have been crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, not necessarily anticipating this. And the second part is when Carter signed it, it did not apply to his first term records. So he had announced that should he get reelected, that he would apply the law to his first term, but they actually didn't. So if he had been reelected, he would have had half of his records as the personal property of the president. He said he would have deeded them under those circumstances. And then, so those are two clues as to how they might be litigated. But as Anna's pointed out, just because we have even something clear in an often unclear statute doesn't mean you're going to have success in the courts.
This raises an interesting larger question that goes beyond just Trump and really applies to all the past presidents that are working within this system. And that is, how well are these libraries distinguished from the National Archives? Where does the real power reside within them when it comes to giving scholars, journalists, whatever, access to these records? How well do they work independently from the federal government?
Well, let me just tell you a quick anecdote to give you an idea of where the power lies. The presidential libraries are part of NARA. They're not separate. They're not distinguished from it. But the presidential foundations, the private political organizations that raise the money and build it, they still have a pretty significant presence there, and they cooperate the libraries in terms of public programs. But when I was on the House Oversight Committee, we tried to hold hearings into the relationship between the National Archives and the foundations. And the foundations put pressure on archivist David Ferriero to get us to cancel the hearings. And so we scheduled a hearing. We had witnesses set up. I'm not sure Anne might have actually been on the witness list for that one. I know she was on other ones. And then the archivist came to us and said, please, the presidential foundations they don't want you to have this open discussion about our relationship. Please cancel it. And my boss, the subcommittee chairman, agreed. A few months later, we tried to schedule another hearing, and the same result happened. And so that just gives you a little window into where the power lies when it comes to National Archives and the foundations. And one other point, for the foundations, for the libraries that don't fall under the Presidential Records Act, which are Hoover through Carter, the foundations and the presidential families make the determinations often on who gets to see what records, because they're the ones who created the deed of gift to the National Archives and set up the circumstances for access. So for example, the Kennedy family makes determinations on who can see President Kennedy's health records. That's just one example.
If I can chime in, we do have one question from the audience, and it goes to what we were just talking about, NARA needing more teeth and how can we make sure that the archives has more teeth. The specific question is, would it be a good thing to reduce the required 60% endowment back to 20 to 25%, for example? What would be the impact of that?
Well, the reason why the endowment exists in the first place was that it was costing taxpayers a ton of money to operate and maintain the libraries. And when the Presidential Libraries Act was amended in 1986, the endowment was 20%. But the foundations and the National Archives worked together to figure out a way around that and limit how much space is actually technically considered part of the National Archives space and what systems are involved. And so it worked out to be maybe 5 or 10% rather than 20. So during the George W. Bush administration, Congress upped it first to 40 and then to 60 in the anticipation of the endowment funds generating enough income to cover the costs of the libraries. Now, it might be that 60% is part of what scared off the Obama Foundation from entering into a partnership with the National Archives. And while it's a negative that we don't have a building to store the records, I think it's a positive that we don't have a building where the National Archives is giving the seal of approval to any presidential foundation or former president, whether it be Trump or Obama or Biden.
Yeah, and I'd just like to make the point, I could be wrong, but it's my understanding that the archives was not unhappy with Obama's decision not to have a library, that was in the family of archive managed libraries. And in fact, that they have kind of encouraged this as the model for the future. So I don't think it's really the case that the archives is pushing for, a greater role in presidential libraries. My sense is that they would be happy to have them relegated to, a private entity in which I guess artifacts and letters and papers would be on loan.
Well, maybe you've mentioned Obama. You've both mentioned Obama, and this brings us to again another story about presidential records I think the public doesn't understand very well, and that is the change to this entire sense of how we preserve and give access to records now that the vast majority of them are not physical records, that they are electronic records. And my understanding is that the Obama Foundation will give access to electronic records in some form, but it won't necessarily be in a place where you have to go to a particular site at the Obama Foundation. Can you explain a little bit to us about what has changed in particular with the Obama records?
Well, in terms of access, there's still the same thing that, you can't FOIA for any record for the first 5 years. We don't know of any. I don't know of any relaxation of the restrictions yet. That might have happened. So as far as we know, it's going to be 12 years from the time he leaves office. But when it comes to the processing and the digitization, it's quite new, and some of the details I find alarming, which is that the Obama Foundation is paying for the digitization of the paper records, and according to the memorandum of understanding that the National Archives released, the Obama Foundation chooses the vendor and sets up the circumstances in coordination with the National Archives. But in the past, NARA has always told me that if a foundation wants to do something, say an exhibit or sell something in a gift shop or have a public event, then if they're paying for it, then they get to call the tune. And so it's my understanding that the National Archives is giving over the process of digitization to the Obama Foundation. And the thing that's more alarming to me is that the memorandum of understanding signed between the Obama Foundation and NARA says that National Archives can't publicly discuss the memorandum of understanding without the express written consent of the Obama Foundation. And I'm sure that many people watching might say, well, what's the problem with that? I just urge you to note that the National Archives has said that this is now the new model that they wish to pursue, which means they'd like to have the same model and the same memorandum of understanding with whatever organization the Trump family decides to create. And that's when it starts to become even more alarming to me.
And if I could just add a probably obvious point, but I think it bears emphasis, and that is that we're talking about records that belong to us. The fact that they may be housed in a physical library or a virtual library, or, are being discussed about how a private, library is going to deal with these records in some way, doesn't change the fact that they belong to the people. They are not the personal records. And that was one of the biggest impacts of the Presidential Records Act, because President Nixon took his papers when he left, and Congress realized there'd been this assumption that they were federal records, but that there was nothing codified in law that made them records of the United States. And so one of the, not the only, but one of the key purposes of the Presidential Records Act was to declare that these are records of the United States. So when we're talking, I mean, I think Anthony's right to bring out these private agreements and the extent to which they, are done in secret or may place limitations and we don't know about them. That should trouble us because these are our records. They're not President Obama's personal records. They belong to the government. They belong to the people.
I want to follow up on that, but I want to ask Anthony about what you mentioned in terms of the memorandum of understanding and it not being public, or at least the National Archives not being able to comment on it. What kinds of things would you be worried about are in that document that would be troubling?
Well, it's not so much, I mean, the document has been released, but my questions are, what's the process? For example, the Presidential Records Act says that when the president leaves office, the National Archives gets physical and legal custody of the records. So during this digitization process for the physical records, who has physical custody? Does the foundation have it? Is the foundation paying for private vendors to be doing this on government property? I know that there's been a lot of concern over the years with me and some other commenters that at the presidential libraries, the foundation offices are intermingled with the National Archives. I don't know if it's still the case, but up until several years ago, the Truman Library Foundation had National Archives email addresses and phone numbers. And so then were they generating federal records? Were they private records? Who was paying for that? When you apply those problems to the Obama Foundation's decision and then to the Trump and anyone really, then you get back to Ann's point, which is these are our records, not the personal property of the president. And not even during that 12-year period are they the personal property of the president. They're ours as soon as the president leaves office.
I wanted to follow up with Ann as well about essentially the public's notion of ownership. So back when Nixon potentially could have cleaned his archives of things that would there was outrage at that idea. As we've moved towards electronic records, have we fundamentally at a sort of public level, an innate level, changed our sense of what a record is in a way that we're not so outraged if it just disappears? I mean, we all use, and in fact want to use in some cases, messaging apps that make things disappear. Is there a broader sort of revolution in the public understanding of records that needs to happen at this point?
Well, I think it's funny because, one of the early concerns in the Federal Records Act, which is sort of the counterpart that agencies are bound by, they gave agencies a lot of authority to dispose of records because they understood that, otherwise they would be overwhelmed with paper. So we sort of have the reverse now, right? The amount of paper records is diminishing, I suspect, pretty dramatically. But the amount of electronic records has increased, exponentially. However, it's a lot easier to store and access electronic records than it is paper records. That doesn't really answer your question, but I mean, members of the public are, we use we send email, we intermingle. If you're doing work, it's not unusual, you might throw in especially during the pandemic, hi, how are you? Have you gotten your vaccine yet? Oh, and by the way, and presumably, the White House does the same thing. And they send a lot of electronic records that on their face may not seem very significant. But I think the difference is with the White House, with the president, you can't always assess the significance of the president's records in a contemporary time frame. A lot of what becomes interesting is over time. And that's why, I think the fact that there is even a provision in the Presidential Records Act that allows the president currently to dispose of records that are considered, not permanent, is really misplaced and needs to go. There has to be, I think, a default that everything that comes out of the White House, that everything that's a presidential record needs to be preserved. And we leave it to the archivist after the president has left office to sift through and decide whether or not, in fact, maybe they don't need to keep every letter and email that was sent from someone outside the White House. But the real risk, I would rather err on the side of preserving too much than preserving too little. And these fears are even heightened with President Trump, because as I've been saying, and I believe in my core, I think there's just a huge hole in his historical record, and we're not going to be able to fill it. So, yes, I don't know if it's really a mismatch, to answer your question more directly, between the public's perception and reality. I think it's just when you're talking about the president and the White House, you're talking about a particularly valuable set of records. And if you're over-inclusive in what you preserve, that's far better outcome than to be under-inclusive.
Forgive a naive question, but you have me thinking here just kind of off the cuff, and that is, if one were to look at my records, you would find that I may have initiated a conversation on email, followed up on Facebook Messenger, and finished the job on WhatsApp. 3 different systems, 3 different chains of dialogue. Is there anything in the way that administrations are required to keep records that brings coherence to how they preserve them or present them?
Well, the law requires that if it's a record, it has to be preserved regardless of the medium. And while I think NARA's guidance has sometimes lagged in terms of the specific technologies, I think it's very clear, and amendments to the PRA and FRA made it very clear that regardless of sort of the format, digital or paper, it's a record, and it doesn't change. Its character as a record doesn't change depending on the medium. The problem is that certain technologies just create, real challenges from a records preservation perspective. Disappearing apps obviously create a problem, but so do things like WhatsApp and other applications that you use on your personal phone. People may not know this, but installed in the White House, and it's been there through several terms, several presidents now, is a system that automatically captures every email that's sent on an EOP email system. The individual user does not get to make a decision or a choice about whether it's a presidential record or not. That decision is just automatically made, and everything's preserved. So the real problem comes in is if you use a private email account, if you use your phone and you use WhatsApp on your phone, it's not going to be captured, and you have to actually take steps to ensure that it is captured. And, I think the problem is that too often employees either don't know they have to take those extra steps, or just don't do it, or don't do it and don't capture enough. It's not just enough to capture to screenshot the particular message. You have to also capture what's called the metadata, and you have to capture attachments. And in fact, this was a lawsuit that I was part of that we filed right at the end of the Trump administration. They had an official White House policy that allowed them for WhatsApp to only screenshot. They said that was good enough. And we said, no, it's not. If you do a screenshot, you're still not collecting a lot of data that under NARA guidance is record data. So.
We're getting awfully close to the end. I wanted to ask Lisa if there are any more questions from the folks who are listening in. And if not, I have one really quick question I want to ask Anthony, and then maybe get a closing comment from both of our panelists. Anthony, you mentioned that at one point you were working for a member of Congress who was thinking of having hearings looking at the relationship between the presidential foundations and NARA. Why do you think the pressure was brought to not have those? What particular things, what lines of questioning would have been problematic for the presidential foundations?
Well, to give you an idea, that was in, I believe, 2010, and the Democrats lost the House in 2010. and it flipped to the Republicans. And in February of 2011, the National Archives enthusiastically brought all of the presidential library directors to Washington to hold a Republican-held conference on America's treasures, the presidential libraries. And the foundations were there, and they had a very long hearing on the same day, celebrating these treasures. And so the concern wasn't that the public not learn about it. The concern, I believe, was that the public not learn what actually happens and what the relationships are and how much political pressure is brought to bear, not just on the content of exhibits and the speaker series participants, but also the conduct of the main focus of presidential libraries. Just 2 years ago, the Johnson Library hired their first federal director, who was an historian. They'd never had an historian as the LBJ library director. And the foundation put out a press release to great acclaim. The National Archives said this is great. He's a very well-respected historian of Vietnam, and he lasted 8 months until the LBJ Foundation didn't like the fact, this is what has been reported and what we understand from sources, that he was operating the library according to the law, that he was operating in a nonpartisan way. And there's a lot more in the older libraries to do with public programming and exhibits, but there's still records that need to be processed and opened and decisions that have to be made by federal employees. And that private foundation got a federal employee fired for no cause other than administering in good faith the law. And so I think that's the short answer to what kind of lines of questioning would they want the public not to know.
Great. Well, so we're just a couple minutes from being at the top of the hour, and I wanted to ask if both of you would be just give us a final comment, final thoughts, anything that we've talked about, advice, how things have changed. Anthony?
I think the two things that if you're an interested party, if you're a stakeholder, if you're a member of a professional organization or an open government advocate, I think the two things that you should be concerned about are, I think it's great that we're focusing on preservation, because if you don't preserve the records, we won't have access to them ever. But the overwhelming majority of effort has been placed in preservation. The lawsuits that have been brought for decades, the idea for legislative reform has all been about how do we make sure that the White House preserves those records. The problem is once they get preserved, they go to the National Archives, which spends far more money on celebrating presidents than it does on hiring archivists to preserve and open these records. And so I think the next step really for all organizations interested in having access to presidential records is taking the victories and the momentum from preservation fights and bringing it more towards access. And the second part is, don't consider that because the National Archives has a unique and historic mission, that everyone who leads the organization over time is dedicated solely to that mission. And I think that NARA gets a pass. For example, if the Department of Energy had a private foundation run by ExxonMobil inside its facilities, then organizations working for renewable energy would be upset about that. The problem, I think, is that most of the stakeholders in the National Archives subsystem are folks who need the National Archives. They're researchers, they're government advocates, they're FOIA litigators who need to have and maintain a good relationship. And so it's a struggle between criticizing too much and letting things slide. So again, don't think that it's just about preservation, and don't think that it's that the National Archives isn't part of the problem in getting access to presidential records.
Great. And Anne?
So we've been talking a lot about the legal niceties of the Presidential Records Act and how it works. And I want to take a step back and really, I think, pick up a theme that you sounded in your article that Lisa mentioned at the outset when she introduced you. It's easy to forget now that we're in calmer times, but we just went through what I think is an historically unprecedented attack on our democracy. I think the verdict is still out, how much our democracy is held. We will see that. I think that to have a president who refused to participate in the peaceful, not only refused to participate in the peaceful transfer of power, but challenged that very institution, I think raises enormous questions. And when we're talking about presidential libraries, I think the first question is, does President Trump deserve to have a library? And I would answer no. it's not just a question of does he deserve it. I think the risk that he will use that kind of an institution to perpetuate lies and untruths that really are so incredibly harmful to our democracy is just too great of a risk. And, you know, I think it is different in kind. Yes, we've had presidents before. President Nixon, of course, comes to mind, but he's not the only one, who have tested our democracy, but nothing like this. And I think, you know, the other question, picking up what Anthony said, is a question of access. And he's right, a lot of our litigation and a lot of our legislative reforms that groups that I've been involved with have been pushing have to do with ensuring preservation. But access is a real key. And I think we really, when it comes to President Trump's records, we need to fundamentally rethink the idea that there should be some kind of a hold on when the public can get access. Because I think for us to move past and make sure that what happened under President Trump never happens again, we need to know what happened, and we need to know why it happened. And the only way we find that out is to get access to his records. I'm not naive enough to think that a statute aimed at his records could pass. You know, there was a statute aimed specifically at President Nixon's records, and it had bipartisan support and it passed. I don't think we would get that today, and that troubles me. So I think, you know, we're going to have to look at other ways to counter what I think will continue to be a disinformation campaign. And the thought that the archives and the records of this administration could be used to further that disinformation campaign troubles me greatly.
Thank you. Well, you've brought up a word at the very end of our conversation, disinformation, which I think is probably the key one that we need to be thinking about right now. And it certainly was for me, realizing that Trump was not just a president who, you know, wanted to burnish his record, maybe, you know, fudge a few facts here or there, put some spin on things, but has initiated a new era in how Americans relate to public records, and that's the era of disinformation. And that's probably a subject for another panel, certainly not one that we can get into today. So I'm going to turn it back to Lisa for a few closing remarks.
Thanks. I just want to thank the panelists. You know, this has been a really quick moving conversation. I would just point everybody to the chat. We do have a clarification from Nara about the difference between a presidential library and a building. And of course, Nara views the library as the documents, and regardless of where those documents reside. So I just wanted to make sure people saw that. I do think that we are in a new era, and that, you know, as a public, we need to demand more actual information, more factual information, and recognize the fact that these records do belong to all of us, as Anne pointed out. And I think we need to also demand more of Congress. This is also gets to a balance of power issue. And so I think that Congress needs to figure out a way to enforce the laws we currently have, in addition to reforming the laws so that they're stronger, so that we capture all of this information for the future, and so that we can analyze it and understand it, because it's going to take a long time, I think, to analyze and understand all of this. So we need all the documents, and we need access to all of them. And I think we really need to demand that Congress helps us get that. So I want to thank all of you, and really appreciate your time, and enjoy the rest of Sunshine Week. And let's learn a lot about open records. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.